Hey there, we're taking a look at Wolfenstein 2, the new Colossus running on the AMD Ryzen 5 5500U. Now this is running, of course, on the TRIGKEY system that we have taken a look at before. We're currently looking at the game right now running with the lowest in-game graphics settings, and we are running this at the full 1080p resolution. Overall, the level of performance that we're getting here is actually surprisingly decent. This game, of course, running on the Vulkan API right now, which I think is really helping out the overall experience. It's not going to be a absolutely rock solid experience. As you can tell, our 1% lows are dropping down into the 30s, but considering that it is a single player experience, you don't necessarily need to have the highest FPS possible. And considering that we are able to play this at the full 1080p resolution, though with some sacrifices, of course, in the overall visual quality, because we are using the lowest in-game graphics settings, you're still more than capable of actually fully utilizing the game. Now, of course, you can also set the textures all the way to their maximum. I see a lot of you guys always bring this up, like, why is it that you don't allocate more RAM to the system? Now, all of that just depends on the specific system that you're on. The TRIGKEY here, of course, actually does let you adjust your VRAM allocation, but the laptop that I have with the Ryzen 5 5500U does not. For this particular system, I do have 3 gigabytes allocated. But what you need to understand with APUs is that you actually don't need to allocate more RAM to the particular system itself for VRAM. APUs pretty much almost since their inception on AM4 have been able to dynamically adjust their own RAM allocation. That's why there really isn't much of a performance difference at all. The only thing that it'll ever really affect is whether or not you can actually play a game that is hardwired to have a minimum amount of RAM. Certain titles will just give you warning signals and things like that if you have less than 2 gigabytes allocated, or sometimes even less than 4 gigabytes. But allocating more RAM does not actually improve your overall performance. It's going to perform identically whether you had more or less allocated. All it's going to do is let you get past any potential hardwired barriers. But in this situation, you can see here, we're not exactly utilizing a lot of RAM with the lowest in-game graphics settings. We are, of course, using 16 gigabytes in this situation. Now, if you have 8 gigabytes of RAM, you're more than likely going to be able to get away with it with the absolute lowest in-game graphics settings. But if you have 16 or 32 gigabytes of RAM, feel free to max out the textures. This is not going to affect your performance at all, because again, the system will be able to dynamically adjust how much RAM it can use. And funnily enough, this is kind of one of those situations where APUs can even be better than most lower end graphics cards that actually come with pretty much 4 gigabytes or even less amount of RAM. And graphics cards themselves can't dynamically adjust their VRAM. So what ends up happening in those situations is that you're just stuck with 4 gigabytes of RAM at most. While an APU, as long as you have the right amount of system RAM, you could pretty much just put as much RAM as you want in terms of VRAM allocated, or the system will just utilize it on its own. So if you have a game where if you set the textures all the way to ultra, it ends up using 16 gigabytes. Well, if you have a 32 gigabyte system, it can't actually just utilize all full 16 gigabytes worth of VRAM if it needed to, and you're actually going to be able to play with higher resolution textures than a graphics card that only has 4 gigabytes of built-in RAM. Now, of course, since it's system RAM, it's going to be running at a much lower speed, but a lot of the times once things are actually already loaded into the RAM itself, well, it won't need to swap anything out. You're doing a lot less swaps the more RAM that you have. So for systems like this, especially at the price points that 32 gigabytes of RAM is at, it might not actually be a bad move to pick that up. Well, I've seen actually some kits that are 64 gigabytes that were less than $100. You ever see sodium RAM on sale, 64 gigabytes for less than $100? That's almost an insta buy, because that means that any game out there that you just try to play that has high resolution textures, you can pretty much just max out the textures, set everything else to its lowest setting, and you're still going to get some nice visual quality out of it. You just won't have these extra effects that a lot of the times don't necessarily make a drastic difference visually speaking, but they will greatly affect performance. The level of performance that we are getting out of this game right now on this system is actually really nice because of the fact that we're able to stay consistently above 30. It is a single player game, so this is more than adequate enough, especially since we get to enjoy the full resolution. But of course, keep in mind that this system is by default configured to run at 25 watts. Your particular system might only be limited to 15 watts. It really just depends on what the exact laptop or mini PC you actually end up having with this chip. So if you're interested in actually getting this level of performance, I would recommend that you actually pick up this TRIGKEY, since I've actually tested it out. The HP laptop that I have been using before this does have a noticeable gap in terms of performance, even when you configure the TDP higher. And it really just seems to be because it was just not designed to run all the way at 25 watts. So even at 25 watts, in things like Cinebench, there seems to be an almost 1,200 point deficit between the two. It's definitely something to keep in mind there. Not all systems with the same chip are going to perform the same, but this is the most ideal situation with the Ryzen 5 5500U. So it's definitely a playable experience, and I would actually recommend playing this series on here. Ironically, this actually performs better than the original, just because the original has always seemed to have problems running on AMD systems. This one was far more optimized, and Vulkan is of course a wonderful API that pairs really well with these AMD systems. But anyways, I'll catch you in the next one.